August 14th, 1942. Paris, France. The summer sun hung heavy over the streets of occupied Paris, but the city was far from serene. Behind the crisp uniforms and the hum of Nazi patrols, there was an undercurrent of resistance, silent and patient. Among the residents of the city, there were whispers, silent prayers in the dark corners of apartments, in quiet cafes, on forgotten alleyways. They knew the cost of defiance. They knew the punishment for even the smallest act of resistance. But in the midst of fear, there were those who, in their quiet way, began to question. The boy was one of them. Not a soldier, not a leader, just a teenager, his name lost in the annals of history, his face a fleeting shadow in the records of the war. But on that hot summer day, in 1942, he became something more. He became the key, the weapon nobody had considered. He had begun to notice something others hadn't. It was something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it was almost easy to overlook. But he had an eye for details, his mind always alert, always calculating. It started with the sound of boots, the sound of soldiers marching, the sound of patrols moving through the streets of Paris at regular intervals. There was a rhythm to it. It wasn't chaotic or random. It was a pattern, a regularity that, like clockwork, ticked through the heart of the city. At first, he wasn't sure what it meant. He simply noted it down, scribbled the times, the directions, the streets. He was a kid, after all. What did he know about military strategy? What did he know about the way armies moved? But something inside him told him that this small observation mattered. The patrols weren't just scattered, like the mindless movements of an occupation force. They were coordinated, systematic. The Germans, for all their might, were repeating the same patterns day after day, night after night. A turn here, a left at the corner, a stop at the same alley. It was as if the city, with all its winding streets and narrow passages, was being mapped out by the rhythm of their boots. And the more he watched, the more he realized that the Germans were not as omnipotent as they seemed. They had a weakness, a crack in their armor. He didn't tell anyone at first. What could he say? I've noticed the way the soldiers walk. His friends, his family, they were all preoccupied with survival. The older generation was focused on staying hidden, staying out of sight, staying alive. His own parents had been too consumed with their fears to notice the small things that he had come to understand. The resistance, at least in his neighborhood, was too fragmented to act on a simple observation. But that didn't stop him. Instead, he took to the streets on his own, day after day, notebook in hand. He watched. He listened. He counted. The boot steps became a symphony to him, each step a note in a song of survival and subversion. There was no hurry, no grand plan. He simply observed, like a watcher in the wings of a theater. As he continued to map out the movements, he began to see even more details. How certain soldiers always passed by certain places at exactly the same times. How the same routes were used again and again. The patterns began to emerge more clearly. And with each new observation, the boy's confidence grew. His notebook was full now, pages and pages of details. The soldiers, for all their power and control, were predictable. But then came the realization, this wasn't enough. Just noticing the pattern wasn't going to change anything. His mind raced as he thought about how to use this knowledge. He had seen enough. He had witnessed enough to understand one thing. The people of Paris, the ones under the occupation, they weren't just being oppressed by the Nazi soldiers. They were being oppressed by a lack of awareness, by the darkness of their own ignorance of how the enemy operated. What they needed wasn't just courage, it was intelligence. It was the ability to outthink the occupiers, to turn their strengths into weaknesses. The boy had no weapons, no army at his back. But he had something better. He had time. He had information. And with that information, he had the power to change the course of small battles. But as the weeks passed, he became more acutely aware of the dangers. There were others in the city, others who had seen what he had seen, and there were whispers about the Gestapo. The punishment for even the smallest act of disobedience was swift, brutal, and public. A man who had stolen a loaf of bread was shot in the street as a warning. People disappeared in the night, dragged away by Nazi soldiers, never to be seen again. He began to fear that his observations might draw attention. The resistance might catch on, yes. But so could the enemy. And then what? He was just a kid. What could he do? Yet the idea that the Nazi occupiers could be outsmarted, no matter how impossible it seemed, refused to leave him. One afternoon, while standing at the corner of a busy street, his notebook open as always, he had a moment of clarity. It wasn't enough to just watch anymore. It was time to do something with what he had learned. But to whom could he turn? Who could he trust with this information? He was a teenager. After all, just another face in a city full of fearful, anonymous faces. He thought about the small acts of resistance that had already begun to take root across the city. Sabotage, stolen supplies, whispers in the dark. But none of those things had the scale of what he was now seeing. This wasn't about hiding in shadows. This was about using the patterns of the occupation itself to push back. But that decision, the decision to act, wasn't an easy one. And it didn't come all at once. It came in pieces like a puzzle being slowly assembled. The boy didn't know how to begin or what to do with the information he had. But he knew one thing. If he kept quiet, if he did nothing, the occupation would continue as it always had. And that, to him, was a far worse fate than anything that might happen if he tried to make a difference. So, on the evening of August 14th, 1942, he stepped forward, carefully folding his notebook into his coat pocket, and began to walk toward the edge of the city, his mind racing with possibilities. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that this was the moment when history began to turn one step at a time. The world would never know his name. His role in the resistance would remain unknown. But the small actions of one boy, armed with only his observations, would set something in motion, something that could not be stopped. And as he walked through the streets of Paris, his footsteps mingling with those of the soldiers he had been watching, he realized that in the silence, in the shadows, in the spaces between those boots on the cobblestones, a revolution had already begun. November 4th, 1942. Paris, France. The cold winds of winter had begun to seep into the bones of the city. The streets of Paris, already darkened by the occupation, now felt even more oppressive. The resistance, disjointed and fragmented, had managed only small victories, pockets of sabotage and whispers of uprisings, but nothing that truly threatened the occupation. The enemy's presence was everywhere, in every corner of the city, in every alleyway. Fear had settled like a permanent fog, shrouding the minds of Parisians in a sense of helplessness. But for the boy, the rhythms of the streets were still clear in his mind. He had never stopped watching, never stopped counting. His notebook was now filled with precise details, times, routes, shifts. He knew the city better than anyone, better than the German soldiers, who marched blindly through it each day. It was a quiet morning when he decided that the time had come. His observations had been enough to form a plan that he knew could make a difference. He had watched them long enough to understand where the vulnerabilities lay. The patrols that passed by certain areas every day, the predictable routes that the soldiers walked, there was an undeniable pattern in their movements. It was there, hidden in plain sight, in the beats of their boots on the cobblestones. But what was he supposed to do with this information? He was just a boy after all. His family knew nothing of his nightly notes, his secret observations. And the resistance? They would never believe him. Why would they? They were focused on large operations, major acts of sabotage. They were organizing bombings and orchestrating ambushes. He was nothing but an anonymous kid, unnoticed in the chaos of city at war. His notebook didn't seem like much, just scribbles, numbers, and observations. It didn't have the power to stop the occupation, or so he thought. But then, something inside him changed. There was no point in waiting anymore. If he kept his knowledge to himself, the occupation would continue to choke the life out of the city, its people, and its future. There had to be a way to use what he knew, his understanding of their patterns, of their every move. It was then that he remembered a conversation he'd overheard in a cafe a few weeks ago. A man had been talking about resistance cells, how they operated in silence, how they had begun to coordinate small attacks across the city. The cell he'd heard about was small. Only a handful of men and women, living in the shadows, gathering what little they could to disrupt the Nazis. They had managed a few successful operations, but nothing significant enough to change the course of the war. Yet, it was clear that they were willing to do more. They just needed the right information, the right plan. The boy knew he had to find them. He didn't know where to start, but he had no choice. He couldn't sit idle anymore. He had the power to do something, even if it was just a small part in the grand scheme of things. He had to act. He set off for the heart of the city, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the resistance. It was a dangerous task, walking through the heart of the city during the day. The German soldiers patrolled everywhere, their eyes sharp for anyone acting out of place. But the boy was careful. He knew the city better than the soldiers. He knew where to turn, when to pause, when to disappear into the shadows. Hours passed as he searched, but finally, as dusk began to fall, he found what he was looking for. A small cafe on the corner of Rue de la Hachette. The sign was barely visible, hanging loosely from the wall, but it was there. This was where they met. He had seen it before, though he had never ventured inside. It was a place where the city's resistance gathered, where plans were made, where voices whispered, and where the war was fought in secret. The boy's heart raced as he entered. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know how to present himself. He was just a child in a room full of adults, a boy with no military training, no weapons, no experience. Yet, he had something they didn't, a detailed map of the Nazi patrols, the exact locations and times they passed through the city. His observations, his calculations, could be the key to something bigger. It wasn't much, but it was something. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere was heavy, tense. A few men and women sat at a table near the back, talking in hushed tones, their faces wary. They looked up as the boy entered, their eyes filled with suspicion. But he didn't falter. He walked up to the table, laid his notebook down in front of them, and began to speak. The words came out in a rush at first, his fear and anxiety pushing him to speak faster, to explain himself before they had a chance to dismiss him. "I know where they are," he said, pointing at the page of his notebook. "I know when they move. I know where they walk. I've been watching them for months." The resistance members exchanged cautious glances, their eyes narrowing. One man leaned forward, his expression hard. "And who are you, kid? What do you think you're doing here?" But the boy didn't back down. "I know their movements. I can help you. If you listen to me, we can use this." There was silence for a long moment. The man looked at the boy, then at the others at the table. There was a flicker of doubt, but then something else, something like realization, seemed to spark in their eyes. The boy could see it. They were considering it. They were considering him. Finally, the leader of the group spoke. "What's your plan, then?" And with that simple question, the boy became part of something larger than himself. It wasn't just about his observations anymore. It was about taking action, about using the knowledge he had gathered to make a real difference. He wasn't just a kid on the sidelines anymore. He had a role to play, a part to take in this quiet war that was being waged beneath the surface of the city. Over the next few days, the boy worked alongside the resistance, guiding them through the movements of the German patrols. Using his knowledge of the patrol's patterns, they orchestrated a series of small but effective sabotage operations, disrupting supply lines, sabotaging German vehicles, and striking at their weak points with precision. The boy's plans worked. One by one, the operations unfolded as he had predicted. He was no longer just observing history. He was helping to shape it. But the deeper they went into the heart of the resistance, the more he began to understand the true cost of what they were doing. The threat of discovery was always there, hanging over them like a blade, ready to fall at any moment. And yet, even as the city grew darker and the stakes grew higher, the boy knew that he had become part of something larger, something that could not be stopped. He had outsmarted the enemy, turned their predictable patterns into weapons against them. But the true cost of this rebellion, of this small victory, had yet to be paid. May 25th, 1945. Paris, France. The war had ended, but Paris was not the city it once was. The streets were still scarred from years of occupation, buildings shattered by bombings, windows shattered by the violence of war. The people moved slowly through the streets, their eyes tired, their shoulders heavy with memories of everything they had lost. The Allied forces had come through, liberating the city, but the true cost of the occupation was etched into every face, into every corner of the city. The war was over, but its shadows stretched far into the future. Among the crowd, a man walked alone. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He wasn't a soldier, nor was he a hero recognized in the history books. He was just a man who had been a boy once, a boy who had watched the streets of Paris, counted the steps of the German soldiers, and had used his knowledge to change the course of small battles. He had been part of the resistance, yes, but the recognition, the praise, none of it had come his way. His name was lost, forgotten, erased from the narrative of the war. He moved through the city, his eyes scanning the familiar streets, the same streets where he had once watched the Nazis march by, their boots echoing in the silence. The same streets where he had counted every step, every patrol, and had turned that knowledge into a weapon. But now, there was no recognition for his efforts, no applause for his quiet victories. The war had ended, and history had moved on, sweeping him and his contributions into the background. In the years since, the boy had grown into a man, but nothing had changed. He had been forgotten. His part in the resistance, his contributions, had been wiped from the records. The larger battles, the famous names, had taken center stage, while his small role remained lost in the cracks of history. It wasn't that he had sought fame or recognition. It was never about that. He had done what he did because it was the right thing to do. But there was something cruel in the silence that followed the war. Something unbearable about being erased from the story. He had given everything for this city, his time, his energy, his very soul. He had watched the soldiers, mapped out their movements, and had guided the resistance in their quiet acts of defiance. It was his observations that had allowed the sabotage operations to succeed. It was his knowledge that had given them the edge, the advantage, the small victories. Without him, the resistance might never have gained the momentum it needed. But no one ever knew his name. No one ever knew what he had done. The people who had worked alongside him had moved on, too. Some had been killed, some had been captured, some had disappeared into the night. Others had gone on to live their lives, their faces etched into the history of the war, their names remembered in the annals of victory. But his name, his quiet, unassuming name, was forgotten, buried beneath the weight of a narrative that had been shaped by the loudest voices, the most dramatic stories. The boy, who had counted every footstep, had become nothing more than a forgotten footnote. As he walked through the streets of Paris, he thought back to the days when he had first begun to understand the rhythms of the occupation. He had been so young, so naive, but in his own way, he had been ahead of the others. While the world around him had been paralyzed by fear, he had seen something others had missed. He had understood the power of information, the strength of small actions, the importance of knowing your enemy not by force, but by observation. It was a quiet form of resistance, one that didn't involve explosions or grand speeches, but one that quietly ate away at the foundation of the occupation. His observations had helped to disrupt their patrols, their routines, their grip on the city. It was a battle fought with patience, with intelligence, with the kind of quiet genius that history had forgotten to acknowledge.